Picture a land of ancient temples and lush landscapes, a place rich in culture and history. Now imagine watching it change virtually overnight into a land of forced labor, starvation, and mass killings. This is the story of Cambodia under Pol Pot, a transformation so dramatic and horrifying, it has left an indelible mark on human history. But how could a single man spearhead such sweeping, destructive change, leading to the deaths of nearly a quarter of his own people? What turned Pol Pot into one of history's most infamous dictators? Today we delve deep into the life and legacy of Pol Pot, the man behind the Khmer Rouge regime. We will explore the storm of circumstances that allowed him to seize power, the devastating policies he implemented, and the global factors that stood in the periphery as a nation crumbled. Join us on this grim yet necessary journey to understand a chapter of history that should never be forgotten, so that it may never be repeated. Cambodia had a rich and diverse history that spanned centuries. Known as the Kingdom of Wonder, its most famous landmark, Angkor Wat, stands as a symbol of the country's grand past. Situated in Southeast Asia, Cambodia was part of a complex web of kingdoms and empires, often under the influence of its more powerful neighbors like Thailand and Vietnam. Despite this, Cambodia was able to carve out its own unique identity, deeply rooted in Buddhism and influenced by Hinduism. In the 20th century, Cambodia found itself entangled in global conflicts and politics, notably becoming a French protectorate from 1863 until its independence in 1953. This period brought modernization, but also a complex set of challenges. The post-independence era was initially marked by optimism and attempts at modernization under King Norodom Sihanouk. However, the nation was soon plunged into a state of turmoil due to the growing influence of communism in the region and the looming shadow of the Vietnam War. Cambodia's fate was drastically altered by its entanglement in the Cold War. As the Vietnam War escalated, Cambodia's borders became increasingly porous and militarized, setting the stage for internal conflict. It's in this backdrop of chaos, violence, and geopolitical maneuverings that Pol Pot and his extremist ideology found fertile ground. A society that had been teetering on the edge was now ripe for the emergence of a radical regime that promised stability, but would instead unleash unprecedented horrors. Understanding this complex history is vital in grasping how Cambodia, a nation with such a rich cultural past, could fall under the dark shadow of the Khmer Rouge. As we delve into the years of Pol Pot's reign, remember this backdrop of a fractured nation searching for its identity amid global turbulence. Before delving into the horror that was the Khmer Rouge regime, it's crucial to understand the man who orchestrated it all. Born as Saloth Sar, he came into the world in a small village, Prek Spav, in Kampong Tom Province, Cambodia, in 1925. The village of Prek Spav, where Saloth Sar was born, was a microcosm of Cambodia's complex social fabric. While Cambodia was largely agrarian, the village itself was not isolated from the impact of politics and societal hierarchies. Pol Pot was born into what could be considered the middle class of his village. His family owned a rice farm and even had some connections to the Cambodian royal family. Such status enabled them to afford some luxuries, including the ability to send their children to school, an opportunity that most in the country, and even in their own village, did not have. His family was respected, yet lived modestly. Saloth Sar's early environment was thus one of relative privilege, but it was also steeped in traditional Cambodian values, which included a deep respect for authority and a strong sense of community. Born into a relatively affluent family of farmers, Saloth Sar's early years gave no clue of the path he would later take. His family had enough means to get him educated, a rarity in a country where many could not afford it. To understand Pol Pot and the choices he would later make, it's essential to grasp the duality of his upbringing. On the one hand, his early years in Prek Spav were rooted in a sort of pastoral ideal, characterized by the natural beauty of Cambodia's countryside and the close-knit community of his village. On the other, his family's connections to the upper echelons of Cambodian society offered him glimpses into a world of influence and power, perhaps planting the seeds of his future ambitions. Before he became the architect of one of history's darkest periods, he was a student, curious, ambitious, and, by all accounts, ordinary. How did his early education shape the man he would become? He first attended a local school, receiving basic education in a setting steeped in traditional Cambodian values. From the outset, his life was guided by a profound respect for authority and hierarchy, themes deeply embedded in Cambodia's social fabric. At an early age, he was sent to the capital city, Phnom Penh, for further education. There he studied at some of Cambodia's best institutions, such as the École Miche, a French Catholic primary school. The experience was transformative, exposing him not just to a broader curriculum, but to a multicultural environment. It was during these formative years in Phnom Penh that he was introduced to Western ideas, specifically French literature and philosophy, which would later be complemented by his exposure to Marxism during his time in France. However, even as his intellectual horizons were expanding, the conservative and hierarchical social norms of his upbringing remained deeply ingrained. This interplay between traditional Cambodian values and new intellectual currents may have sown the seeds of the ideological dichotomy that characterized his later life. By the time he was selected for a scholarship to study in Paris, Saloth Sar was a product of multiple worlds, each with its own set of values, ideals, and complexities. And as we'll see, it was this intricate blend of influences that contributed to the enigma of Pol Pot, setting the stage for the paradoxical and devastating choices he would go on to make. The year is 1949. A young Cambodian named Saloth Sar steps onto French soil for the first time, armed with a scholarship and a sense of purpose. In the heart of intellectual Europe, Paris would come to shape Pol Pot in ways both expected and utterly unforeseen. Pol Pot enrolled in various institutions, including the prestigious École Française de Radioélectricité, but academic success eluded him. In fact, he would never complete his formal studies in France. It's important to understand why a Cambodian like him ended up in Paris in the first place. Why were Cambodians traveling thousands of miles to study in Europe? The answer lies in Cambodia's colonial past. For nearly a century, Cambodia was part of French Indochina, a collection of Southeast Asian territories under French colonial rule. The French sought to create a class of educated Cambodians who would serve as intermediaries between the colonial rulers and the local population. This education was primarily conducted in the French language and was deeply influenced by French culture and thought. However, as the wheels of independence began turning post-World War II, the French started offering scholarships to Cambodian students to study in France. This was both an extension of their colonial policies and an effort to maintain influence in a changing geopolitical landscape. Many of these scholarships were in areas like law, medicine, and engineering, fields that would be vital in an independent Cambodia. It was seen as a win-win. Cambodia would get skilled professionals, and France would maintain cultural and political leverage. It wasn't just about education, though. Paris in the 1950s and 60s was a melting pot of ideologies and cultures. For many young Cambodians, this was an eye-opening experience that went far beyond textbooks. In cafes and meeting rooms, they were exposed to a wide range of political philosophies and revolutionary ideals. Among these students was Saloth Sar, later known as Pol Pot, and his associates, who formed the Paris Circle. Unbeknownst to them, their time in France would do more than just shape their individual lives. It would set the ideological groundwork for a regime that would devastate an entire nation. However, Paris was an education in itself, a hotbed of intellectual and political activity, where Saloth Sar was exposed to Marxist ideology and began attending communist gatherings. In France, Pol Pot and a group of like-minded Cambodian students formed their own circle, deeply influenced by Marxist-Leninist ideologies. This group, later known as the Paris Circle, would become the intellectual core of the Khmer Rouge. It's crucial to understand that during his time in Paris, Pol Pot was not just absorbing ideology. He was adapting it, molding Marxist-Leninist principles into a form he believed would fit Cambodia's unique social and economic landscape. His time in France was transformative but also filled with contradictions. While Saloth Sar was failing in his formal academic pursuits, he was excelling in what would become a dark ideological curriculum, a curriculum that he would later try to impose on an entire nation. As Pol Pot was soaking up ideologies in Paris back home, Cambodia was undergoing political and social upheavals that would later become a breeding ground for the Khmer Rouge. Let's delve into the early roots of this movement and the key players who would become instrumental in its rise. After gaining independence from France in 1953, Cambodia was ruled by King Norodom Sihanouk. He navigated a precarious path between warring geopolitical giants, attempting to maintain Cambodia's neutrality. However, beneath the monarchy's calm surface, political currents were shifting. Several groups, both communist and anti-communist, were jockeying for influence. Among them was the Communist Party of Kampuchea, a somewhat fragmented group that would eventually evolve into the Khmer Rouge. Key figures like Nuon Chi, Ieng Sari, and Khieu Samphan, most of whom had also spent time in France, began to coalesce around the ideologies that Pol Pot was similarly drawn to. Together, they formed the nucleus of what would become one of history's most brutal regimes. The Vietnam War was intensifying, and the US-backed government in South Vietnam was struggling. Cambodia's eastern neighbor was a battleground, and the conflict inevitably spilled over the border. King Sihanouk's delicate balance of neutrality was becoming untenable. This provided the burgeoning Khmer Rouge with an opportunity. Initially seen as a marginal extremist group, they began to gain both traction and support, fueled by growing disillusionment with Sihanouk's rule and anger over US bombings in Cambodian territory. By the time Pol Pot returned from France, the groundwork for the Khmer Rouge had been laid. A combination of geopolitical strife, internal political turmoil, and ideological ferment had created a volatile mix, ready to explode. This was the turbulent landscape that awaited Pol Pot, a landscape where his radical ideologies would find fertile ground. And as we will see, his return would be the catalyst that ignited one of the darkest chapters in human history. We've looked at how Pol Pot was molded by political and ideological forces both in Cambodia and France. Now let's turn our attention to the fateful series of events that catapulted him from an obscure revolutionary to the supreme leader of democratic Kampuchea. How did Pol Pot come to power, and what were the early days of his regime like? How did this relatively unknown figure become the supreme leader of democratic Kampuchea? What machinations propelled him to the pinnacle of authority? Let's explore. While it may appear unified from the outside, the Khmer Rouge was fraught with internal divisions and rivalries. Pol Pot was not an immediate shoo-in for the top position. He had to navigate a complex and often treacherous political landscape. Pol Pot initially held various positions within the Communist Party of Kampuchea, which was the official name of the Khmer Rouge. Over time, his influence grew, especially among the younger, more radical elements within the party. As mentioned earlier, Pol Pot was part of a group known as the Paris Circle, Cambodian students who studied together in France. Many of these individuals were instrumental in consolidating Pol Pot's power, including his close ally Nuon Chi, also known as Brother Number 2. The elevation of Pol Pot to supreme leader is shrouded in mystery, much like the operations of the Khmer Rouge itself. What we do know is that during a secret congress in 1971, Pol Pot was officially named the party's Secretary General. Interestingly, Pol Pot maintained a low profile, even after becoming the supreme leader. His identity was kept a secret from the public. This anonymity was a strategic choice. It made him less vulnerable to both internal and external threats. The name Pol Pot itself is a pseudonym that roughly translates to political potential. It was a name that seemed to be designed to both assert his capabilities and obscure his true identity, which was Saloth Sar. Before we plunge deeper into the abyss of Pol Pot's regime, it's crucial to understand the pivotal event that set the stage for his rise, the ousting of King Norodom Sihanouk. Who was behind it, and how did it change the course of Cambodian history? Norodom Sihanouk was a complex, controversial figure. For years, he'd tried to navigate Cambodia through the labyrinth of Cold War geopolitics, keeping a delicate balance between East and West. General Lon Nol, who would eventually lead the coup against Sihanouk, was originally one of the king's trusted officials. Ambitious and pro-Western, he became increasingly disenchanted with Sihanouk's neutral stance. By 1970, Cambodia was polarized. On one side were supporters of Sihanouk, who saw him as the guardian of Cambodian sovereignty. On the other were anti-communist elements who felt that Sihanouk was too accommodating to North Vietnamese forces operating along the border. On March 18, 1970, while Sihanouk was abroad in France, Lon Nol, backed by anti-communist elements and with tacit American approval, seized control of the government. It was a move that shook the foundations of Cambodia. Immediately after the coup, Sihanouk was deposed, and a new regime called the Khmer Republic was established. Lon Nol quickly aligned himself with the United States and took a hard stance against the Viet Cong and Khmer Rouge. In a twist of irony, the deposed Sihanouk formed an alliance with the Khmer Rouge, who were also fighting against Lon Nol's regime. He became a figurehead, rallying his supporters to join the opposition. With Sihanouk deposed and Lon Nol in power, Cambodia was hurled into a new phase of conflict, one that would open the doors for the Khmer Rouge and eventually Pol Pot to seize control. The country was thrust into chaos, and the stage was set for what would become one of the darkest chapters in human history. The years between the coup that deposed King Norodom Sihanouk in 1970 and the fall of Phnom Penh in 1975 are pivotal to understanding Pol Pot's rise to power. These years shaped not just Pol Pot the man, but also the movement he led. Let's delve into this crucial period. Soon after the coup, Pol Pot aligned himself with deposed King Sihanouk to gain popular support. This was a strategic move. Pol Pot was keenly aware that Sihanouk was still revered among rural Cambodians. During these years, the Khmer Rouge had their stronghold in rural Cambodia, largely in the northeast. Pol Pot focused on building up a peasant-based guerrilla force, moving from village to village, recruiting young men and women, often just teenagers. What made these years so critical for Pol Pot was the way he meticulously organized his forces. He constructed a hierarchy based on loyalty, instilled discipline through ideological training, and fortified his ranks with battle-hardened soldiers. Meanwhile, General Lon Nol's government was losing credibility rapidly. Allegations of corruption, inefficiency, and a draining, inconclusive war effort against the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong gave Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge more than just ideological traction. It gave them a growing base of popular support. By 1973, the Khmer Rouge controlled nearly 60% of Cambodia's territory and more than half of its population. Notably, the U.S. bombing campaign intended to dislodge North Vietnamese forces from Cambodia actually helped Pol Pot recruit thousands to his cause. As we approach 1975, Pol Pot's forces encircle Phnom Penh. The capital, cut off from the rest of the world and suffering from extreme food shortages, was a ripe target. Pol Pot's vision was on the brink of becoming a devastating reality for millions of Cambodians. April 17, 1975. A day forever etched into the memory of Cambodia. On this day, Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge army marched into Phnom Penh, unopposed but heavily armed. It was the end of one chapter for Cambodia and the beginning of one of the darkest periods in human history. As they captured the city, the Khmer Rouge announced on the radio that they had come to liberate the people from imperialism and corruption. But liberation was the last thing on Pol Pot's mind. Within hours, the grim reality set in. Pol Pot's forces began a forcible evacuation of Phnom Penh, sending its residents on a grueling march to the countryside. The city became a ghost town overnight. Pol Pot had meticulously planned this moment for years, and his vision was clear: to reset Cambodia to year zero, erasing its past and reshaping it into an agrarian utopia, as he called it. But what unfolded was anything but utopian. In the following weeks, the Khmer Rouge moved quickly to consolidate power. Currency was abolished, education systems dismantled, and religion suppressed. Entire families were separated and sent to different labor camps. Intellectuals and professionals were particularly targeted, many executed on the spot. Pol Pot wasn't just capturing a city, he was capturing the very soul of a nation, contorting it into a horrific shape that still defies comprehension. What we must understand is that Pol Pot didn't act alone. His regime was the result of an ideology, one that attracted and indoctrinated thousands. Yet its destructive force was largely driven by one man's relentless vision for a new Cambodia. The fall of Phnom Penh in 1975 was a watershed moment, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to unfathomable suffering and loss. And behind it all was Pol Pot, now the absolute ruler of a broken Cambodia. As we've seen, Pol Pot didn't rise to power by chance. His success, and the scale of the tragedy that followed, was due in no small part to the well-calculated strategies and tactics employed by the Khmer Rouge. In this chapter, we take a closer look at the framework that enabled their devastating impact. First, the ideological conditioning. Pol Pot knew that for his extreme vision to be realized, he needed an army deeply committed to his cause. To achieve this, he implemented stringent ideological training programs, often in isolated camps. These weren't just training facilities. They were ideological crucibles, where soldiers and even children were conditioned to become part of Pol Pot's vision for a new Cambodia. These camps were strategically located far from prying eyes, often deep within jungles or mountainous terrains. Such isolation made these camps effective centers for indoctrination, as those inside were cut off from outside influences and news. The conditions were brutal, but that was by design. Pol Pot believed that hardship would harden his cadre, turning them into relentless, obedient soldiers, unswayed by emotion or ethical dilemma. It's vital to understand the role these isolated camps played. They were more than just military installations. They were factories that produced the human instruments necessary to carry out Pol Pot's devastating plans. Second, the leveraging of discontent. Pol Pot brilliantly exploited the vacuum left by the failed governance of Lon Nol and the resentment against American bombings. He positioned the Khmer Rouge as the sole patriotic force capable of reclaiming Cambodian identity. Next was tactical guerrilla warfare. The Khmer Rouge rarely confronted their enemies head-on. Instead, they focused on hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and attrition warfare to wear down their foes, all while avoiding significant losses. Unlike traditional armies that rely on brute force and numbers, Pol Pot's forces focused on swift, unpredictable actions. They would often strike at night, catching their enemies off guard, and then melt back into the jungle, leaving behind confusion and chaos. This guerrilla approach allowed the Khmer Rouge to take on a far superior enemy in terms of weaponry and numbers. It created a sense of omnipresence and invincibility around them, sowing fear and doubt among both their enemies and the Cambodian populace. The genius of these guerrilla tactics lay in their psychological impact as much as their military effectiveness. They facilitated the Khmer Rouge's rise to power by allowing them to wage a war of attrition, gradually eroding the will and capability of their enemies to fight back. Understanding the role of guerrilla warfare in Pol Pot's strategy provides us with yet another piece of the puzzle, shedding light on how a relatively small, under-equipped force could topple a government and bring an entire nation to its knees. Pol Pot also knew the importance of strongholds. The Khmer Rouge set up bases in remote, yet strategically important areas. These served not only as training camps, but also as centers for recruitment and ideological instruction. Information control was crucial. The Khmer Rouge had an intricate network of spies and informants within villages, and even within their ranks, ensuring complete allegiance to the party and immediate detection of dissent. A society under surveillance lives in fear, and fear was a tool Pol Pot wielded with surgical precision. The intricate web of information control and informants within the Khmer Rouge regime was a critical element in sustaining its reign of terror. From the highest echelons of leadership to the most isolated rural village, no one was beyond the reach of the regime's spy network. Family members were encouraged, often coerced, to report on each other, and friendships were strained under the weight of mutual suspicion. This wasn't just a random gathering of information. It was a highly organized system where collected data was methodically analyzed and used to weed out any potential threats to the regime. The implications were chilling. Even a whispered word of dissent could lead to arrest, torture, or worse. The very fabric of Cambodian society was re-engineered into a state of collective paranoia. Finally, the politics of alliances. Pol Pot was adept at securing support, not just from the local population, but also from foreign governments. particularly China. This allowed the Khmer Rouge to be well-funded and well-equipped. Chief among these alliances was the support from Communist China. Beijing provided financial aid, military assistance, and even ideological guidance to Pol Pot's regime. This international backing gave the Khmer Rouge a level of credibility and resources that they otherwise might not have had. But it wasn't just China. Other nations and organizations turned a blind eye or were actively complicit in supporting the regime, often for their geopolitical reasons. The politics of the Cold War played a significant role in this tangled web of alliances. Such alliances had a twofold impact. Internally, it bolstered the Khmer Rouge's position, offering them a shield against domestic and international criticism. Externally, it complicated any efforts to intervene or topple the regime, as global politics often took precedence over human rights concerns. These strategies and tactics weren't just a blueprint for seizing power. They laid the groundwork for the totalitarian regime that followed, in which Pol Pot had near absolute control over every facet of Cambodian life. As we move forward into the darkest chapters of this story, we must keep in mind the calculated methods that made the Khmer Rouge regime not just possible, but chillingly efficient. This wasn't mere happenstance. It was a meticulous, coldly executed plan. As we delve into the repercussions of Pol Pot's reign, it's crucial to approach this chapter with the gravity it deserves. The word genocide is not one to be used lightly. Yet there's no other term that adequately captures the enormity of the loss and suffering inflicted upon the Cambodian people. As we seek to understand the full scope of the Pol Pot era, it's essential to focus on a specific harrowing period between 1976 and 1978. These years witnessed some of the most intense political purges, even within the ranks of the Khmer Rouge itself. Pol Pot's paranoia seemed to know no bounds, extending not just to the populace, but to members of his own party. Accusations of disloyalty or suspicions of counter-revolutionary activities were enough to prompt brutal purges within the organization. Several high-ranking officials, once close allies of Pol Pot, found themselves accused of plotting against the regime. What followed were internal trials, mostly sham in nature, which almost invariably led to their execution. It wasn't just the leadership who felt the brunt of these purges. A wave of terror trickled down, implicating families, associates, and even distant acquaintances of the accused, deepening the climate of fear and distrust. These political killings serve as a dark testament to the regime's self-destructive tendencies. While attempting to root out perceived threats, Pol Pot further isolated himself and weakened the organizational structure of the Khmer Rouge. In examining these political purges, we're faced with the chilling realization that, for Pol Pot, the enemy wasn't just outside the party or among the intellectual elites, it was within his own ranks. And this internal breakdown, fueled by incessant purges, contributed to the regime's eventual collapse. It becomes crucial to identify the specific groups within the Cambodian population that were most at risk. It's a painful acknowledgement, but one that's essential to understand the calculated malice of the Khmer Rouge. Intellectuals and educated individuals were among the first to be systematically targeted. The regime's mistrust of education made teachers, doctors, engineers, and even students enemies of the state. Urban residents were also singled out. The Khmer Rouge had a vision of an agrarian utopia, and city dwellers were considered impediments to this vision. Many were forcibly relocated to the countryside to work in labor camps. Ethnic minorities and religious groups faced horrific discrimination and persecution. The Khmer Rouge sought to establish a homogeneous Khmer society, and anyone who didn't fit this narrow definition was at risk. Lastly, anyone with connections to foreign governments or international organizations was seen as a potential spy or traitor, making them prime targets for arrest and execution. This targeted approach wasn't just about removing perceived threats, it was about eradicating entire ways of life, diverse thoughts, and differing cultures. It was a strategy to reshape Cambodia in Pol Pot's flawed image. In an endeavor to faithfully document the atrocities of Pol Pot's regime, it's unavoidable to touch upon the unsettling notion of brutality. Though we won't delve into explicit details, understanding the extent of the regime's callousness is critical for the full historical context. One of the most harrowing aspects of the Khmer Rouge's reign was the psychological warfare they waged. Every act of brutality was not merely an attack on the body, but also an assault on the mind and spirit. Family ties, friendships, and communal bonds, things that often give us strength, were exploited to maximize psychological pain. The regime sought to break not just individuals but the very fabric of society. The absence of humanity in the acts perpetrated by the regime creates a dark void in Cambodia's history. And while we cannot fill this void, we can pledge to remember it so that such history does not repeat itself. The term killing fields is one that carries an immense weight. These were the sites where countless Cambodians lost their lives under Pol Pot's regime. And while we'll steer clear of the grim specifics, the import of these locations in understanding the depths of human suffering cannot be understated. What you must grasp is that these fields were not just geographically spread across Cambodia. They were symbolic of a broader systemic operation by the Khmer Rouge to exterminate those they considered undesirable. People were often transported to these sites after undergoing unimaginable hardship. The journey to the killing fields was a final, harrowing ordeal that many were forced to endure. Today, the killing fields stand as solemn memorials, a haunting reminder of a past that must not be forgotten. They have been transformed into sites of education and remembrance. This segment is not meant to shock or sensationalize, but to underline the deep tragedy that befell the people under the Khmer Rouge. By acknowledging this dark chapter, we can contribute to the discourse that prevents such acts from happening again. It's estimated that nearly 2 million people lost their lives, either due to execution, forced labor, or starvation. That's almost a quarter of Cambodia's population at the time, a loss so profound that its impact is felt to this day. The genocide targeted intellectuals, professionals, and anyone suspected of having imperialist loyalties. But the wave of terror swept across entire communities, leaving no family untouched. It's important to note that the scars left behind are not just physical, but also psychological. The generation that survived carries the trauma, which is then passed down to younger generations, perpetuating a cycle of pain and fear. Efforts for justice have been long, complicated, and, some argue, insufficient. While some individuals have been tried and convicted, many feel that true justice remains elusive. Yet, even in the face of this unfathomable tragedy, the spirit of resilience among the Cambodian people is evident. They've made significant strides in rebuilding their nation, preserving their culture, and ensuring that the world never forgets what happened. As we conclude this chapter, let's remember that our aim is not merely to recount a dark chapter in human history, but to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. We owe it to the victims and survivors to keep their stories alive, learn from them, and work towards a world where such atrocities are relegated to the pages of history, never to be repeated. As the proverb goes, the wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. While the reign of Pol Pot seemed interminable to the millions suffering under his regime, it eventually did come to an end. How? Let's explore. By the late 1970s, Pol Pot's government had garnered international attention and widespread condemnation. Yet it was internal strife and external conflicts that led to the regime's downfall. Vietnam played a pivotal role in overthrowing Pol Pot. The Vietnamese had initially supported the Khmer Rouge, but relations soured due to border disputes and ideological differences. By late 1978, they had seen enough. The tensions were multifaceted, border disputes became frequent, and ideological differences widened. Perhaps more importantly, Pol Pot's increasingly aggressive actions against Vietnamese communities couldn't be ignored. By 1978, Vietnam had resolved to intervene. They believed that the Khmer Rouge posed a substantial threat, not just to Cambodians but to regional stability as a whole. The decision wasn't made lightly, but when it was, the action was swift. In January 1979, Vietnamese forces, along with dissident Cambodian troops, stormed into Phnom Penh and ousted the Khmer Rouge. This military intervention was swift and decisive, leading to the establishment of the People's Republic of Kampuchea, backed by Vietnam. The fall of Pol Pot's regime did not immediately result in his capture or demise. Instead, he managed to elude international justice for years, living in the shadows even as his former empire crumbled. After the Vietnamese intervention and the capture of Phnom Penh, Pol Pot and his inner circle fled to the Thai-Cambodian border. There, they reverted to guerrilla warfare, perpetually seeking to regain power. During this period, Pol Pot maintained a low profile but was occasionally interviewed by journalists. In these rare glimpses, he attempted to rationalize his actions but never expressed genuine remorse. Despite his exile and decline in influence, Pol Pot was a figurehead for a diminished but enduring faction of Khmer Rouge loyalists. He was even briefly put on trial by his own faction in 1997, a move seen as more symbolic than substantive. Pol Pot's life ended much as it had been since his fall, shrouded in mystery and isolation. He died on April 15, 1998, under circumstances that remain unclear. There was no grand finale, no international trial, just an unceremonious end to a life that had inflicted so much suffering. In the aftermath of any tragedy, what remains is how it is remembered, commemorated, and its lessons carried forward. Pol Pot's regime left an indelible mark on Cambodia and the world. But what is its enduring legacy? Firstly, Cambodia as a nation has shown remarkable resilience. Despite the harrowing past, it has made strides in rebuilding its infrastructure, governance, and most importantly, its cultural heritage. However, the emotional and psychological scars are passed down through generations. In academic circles, family conversations, and social gatherings, the topic remains a dark shadow, sometimes spoken of, sometimes avoided. Internationally, the Cambodian genocide serves as a case study in the consequences of unchecked power and ideological fanaticism. The phrase "never again" echoes, but so does the imperative for eternal vigilance. As for commemoration, museums, memorials, and annual observances serve as somber reminders. The killing fields, once a place of untold suffering, are now a pilgrimage site for those who seek to understand humanity's darker aspects. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the commitment to education. Knowledge remains one of the most potent weapons against the recurrence of such horrors. The younger generation of Cambodians, and indeed young people worldwide, are tasked with the responsibility to remember, to understand, and to prevent. As we come to the end of this journey through one of the darkest chapters of human history, we are reminded of the high cost of ignorance, the dangers of unchecked power, and the incalculable value of human life. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge stand as a grim testament to the devastation that can be wrought when ideology overrides humanity. The loss of over 2 million lives serves as a somber reminder of the depths to which society can plunge when led astray. But we also speak of resilience, of a nation and a people who have endeavored to rebuild, remember, and educate. In the words of philosopher George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This saying holds as true today as ever. So, as we remember, let us also pledge to learn, to be vigilant, and to strive for a future where such horrors find no refuge. We thank you for taking the time to engage with this crucial period of history.